My husband stood in our bathroom doorway, looked at the pregnancy test in my hand, and told me to get out of his house by morning. He said the baby couldn't possibly be his. I packed one suitcase and left before sunrise. I never once raised my voice. 4 weeks later, my phone rang. A stranger on the other end told me my late husband, the one before this one, had left me a trust worth $120 million. And there was a catch. Welcome back to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate, and I am genuinely thrilled you're here tonight. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and tell me in the comments which city you're tuning in from. I love watching these stories travel around the world. Stick with me, because this one is just getting started. Some nights rearrange your whole life without warning. Mine was a Sunday in late September, standing barefoot on cold tile with a plastic wand in my hand, staring at a result I'd been hoping for since spring. For roughly 10 seconds, I felt nothing but pure, uncomplicated joy. Then my husband's footsteps stopped in the doorway behind me. I'm Olivia Hayes. I was 34 that year, an assistant principal at an elementary school in Nashville, the kind of woman who alphabetizes her spice rack and keeps a running to-do list even on vacation. I had always believed, in a quiet, stubborn way, that decency gets rewarded eventually, that if you showed up honestly for the people in your life, they would show up honestly for you in return. That belief did not survive the year I'm about to tell you about. I'd married Marcus Doyle 3 years earlier. We met through a mutual friend at a housewarming party, back when he was climbing fast through a mid-sized commercial construction firm, and I was newly promoted at my school. He was funny in a way that filled up a room, generous with compliments, quick to pick up a check. His mother, Carol, lived 40 minutes outside the city and had the particular gift of saying something unkind and calling it just being honest. I spent a long time trying to win her over, longer than I probably should have. The first year of our marriage felt, if not effortless, at least workable. We bought a brick 2-story with a wraparound porch, the kind of house I used to point at as a kid and imagine growing old in. Marcus worked long hours overseeing job sites, and I filled the gaps with school events, book club, the ordinary architecture of a full life. On the good weekends, drinking coffee on that porch with the cicadas going in the trees, I could almost forget the small unease that had started, very quietly, to live in my chest. Because if I'm honest with you now, the cracks had been showing for a while before that Sunday morning. The first one I remember clearly came about 14 months into the marriage. Marcus started stepping outside to take calls he used to take right in front of me, walking straight past me mid-sentence, phone already lifting to his ear, screen door banging shut behind him. When I asked once, casually, who he kept ducking outside for, he said it was a supplier having a meltdown over a permit delay. His explanation was smooth. His eyes weren't. Then came the site walkthroughs. Marcus began scheduling evening walkthroughs at properties nowhere near any of his active projects. Tuesdays, sometimes Thursdays, always somehow running past 10 at night. I had no obvious reason to doubt a man in his line of work claiming he needed to check a site after hours. But a walkthrough during a thunderstorm advisory at a property I later learned wasn't even under his company's contract was the kind of detail that lodges itself in your memory and won't leave. The second thing I noticed was smaller and in some ways more damning. A parking citation arrived in the mail addressed to Marcus, issued at an apartment complex across town, for a silver sedan registered under a name I didn't recognize, Coastline Rentals, LLC. When I asked about it, he laughed it off, said it was probably a mix-up with a job trailer parked nearby, and tossed the citation in a kitchen drawer instead of the trash. I didn't argue. But that night, after he fell asleep, I photographed the citation with my phone and saved it under a folder labeled with nothing but a date. By late summer, the temperature in our house had changed in ways I couldn't quite name. Marcus grew impatient over things that used to make him laugh. How long I spent on the phone with my sister, how I organized the pantry, what I chose to watch after dinner. Carol started calling more often, and twice I caught the low murmur of her voice bleeding out from behind Marcus's closed office door, cutting off the moment I walked past. I told myself it was the stress of a big project deadline. I told myself a lot of things that summer, most of them convenient. Then came September. I'd felt off for nearly 3 weeks, bone-tired by 2 in the afternoon, unable to stomach coffee, which had never happened to me in my life. On a Friday during my planning period, I drove to a pharmacy near school and bought a test, tucking it into my bag until I got home that Sunday morning. 2 lines, clear and unmistakable. I sat on the edge of the tub for a long moment before I found the nerve to walk out and find him. There's something I've never told anyone about that particular Sunday morning, not even Dana. In the seconds right before I walked out of that bathroom, I stood in front of the mirror and practiced the sentence out loud, quietly, under my breath, the way you rehearse a difficult presentation before walking into a room full of people who might not want to hear it. I wanted to get the tone exactly right, hopeful, but not so hopeful that I'd embarrass myself if he reacted badly. I didn't yet know how badly he'd react. Some small, protective part of me had already started bracing for it without my permission, the way your body sometimes knows things before your mind is willing to admit them. I want to explain something here because I think it matters. Marcus and I had talked about children exactly twice in 3 years of marriage, vague, hopeful conversations, nothing concrete. But some small, stubborn part of me believed this news might be the thing that pulled us back toward whatever version of us I still remembered loving. I walked out of that bathroom holding the test like it was something fragile, and I found him already awake, already dressed, already halfway into his day. I told him. I set the test on the bathroom counter between us, and his face did something I still think about. Not surprise, not joy, not even confusion. Something closer to calculation. "That's not possible," he said. "That's not my child." The words hit differently than I expected, quieter than I expected, and somehow colder for it. "Marcus, don't do this to me. I need you out of this house," he said, voice flat, already moving past me toward the closet. By morning, I looked at the window, at the gray light just starting to break over the backyard. "This is my home, too," I said, and I meant it to sound stronger than it did. "The house is in my name," he said. "Pack a bag." I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I took my laptop, a week of clothes, my toothbrush, and the small framed photograph of my grandmother that had sat on our dresser since the day we moved in. I walked out the front door while it was still dark, and I heard the deadbolt turn behind me before I'd even reached my car in the driveway. I sat behind the wheel for almost half an hour before I could make myself drive anywhere. The porch light clicked off behind me while I sat there, which felt, absurdly, like the final word in an argument I hadn't gotten to finish. I want to be honest with you, I didn't cry in that driveway. Not because I wasn't devastated, but because what I felt was too large and too strange to come out as tears. It felt like standing at the edge of a math problem with no clean answer. Where would I sleep that night? What was actually mine? What happens to a woman who leaves her own marriage carrying a laptop bag and a photograph of her grandmother? My phone buzzed. It was Dana Michaels, my best friend since our first year teaching together, the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when it costs her something. I called her back and explained what had happened in about 4 sentences, my voice steadier than I expected. There was a pause, and then, "Drive here right now. Don't stop anywhere else." I drove across town to her apartment near Belmont, and she opened the door already in her robe, hair a mess, and didn't ask a single question before pulling me into a hug that nearly buckled my knees. Sometimes that's the entire cure, someone who holds you before she interrogates you. I spent that first night on her pull-out couch, staring at a water stain on her ceiling shaped vaguely like Florida, listening to a freight train somewhere in the distance. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, in that strange, suspended hour where everything feels both too real and not real at all, I made myself think clearly. I was pregnant. I was, for all practical purposes, without a home. My name wasn't on the deed. I had roughly $16,000 saved, a steady salary, and very little else that unquestionably belonged to me. I wasn't helpless, but I was scared, and the man who was supposed to be building a life with me had just told me, without a flicker of hesitation, that he didn't believe the child inside me was his. That sentence circled in my head for hours. Was he so certain because he genuinely doubted me, or because he already knew, somewhere in himself, exactly what he'd been doing behind my back? I tucked the question away next to the parking citation and the vanishing evening calls, in the same mental folder where I was quietly keeping everything. The next morning, Dana made 2 mugs of coffee, slid one across the table, and asked, "So what do you actually want to do?" "I don't know yet," I told her, "but I'm not doing nothing." That was the real turning point, if I'm being honest. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just 2 women and 2 chipped mugs at a wobbly kitchen table. I called my OB that same afternoon to move up my first appointment. I emailed HR at my school district to quietly ask about leave policies for a pregnancy that had, apparently, become far more complicated than expected. I started, almost without deciding to, building a mental list of everything I would need to survive the next several months. At a little past 2 that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't know. I almost silenced it. Something made me answer instead. "Is this Olivia Hayes?" A man's voice, unhurried, precise. "Speaking." "Ms. Hayes, my name is Harold Finch. I'm a partner at Finch & Ambrose, an estate law firm downtown. I apologize for the unusual nature of this call. We had some difficulty tracking down your current information. This concerns the estate of Ethan Ward." For a moment I couldn't breathe properly. Ethan, my first husband. We've been married for 5 years. High school sweethearts who made it work through his medical residency until an aneurysm took him in his sleep at 36, the year I turned 29. We'd been quietly, painfully separated for almost a year before his death, though neither of us had ever finished the paperwork, the way grief sometimes freezes things exactly where they were left. His death had been the hardest thing I'd ever survived, made harder by all the things we never got to resolve. "Mr. Finch, Ethan died almost 6 years ago." "Yes, ma'am, we're aware." His estate was placed into a structured trust shortly before his death, with a 6-year delayed distribution clause. That clause activates this quarter. A brief pause. "Ms. Hayes, Ethan Ward left his entire personal estate to you. Current value, factoring in investment growth over the deferral period, is approximately $120 million. The kitchen went completely silent around me. Dana, sitting across from me with her coffee halfway to her mouth a word, watching my expression shift in real time. "There's one condition attached to the distribution, however," Finch continued. "What kind of condition?" "The trust specifies that the full estate transfers to you only if, at the time of evaluation, you're the sole legal guardian of any minor child in your care, meaning no co-guardian, and no spouse or partner holding a competing parental claim. There's a specific clause excluding any partner who has formally, on record, denied paternity of that child." Another pause. "We're aware of your current circumstances, Ms. Hayes, and I want to be straightforward with you. As written, the condition appears to work strongly in your favor. But the timeline is tight. You have roughly 5 months to establish sole legal guardianship before the final evaluation date." I sat there in Dana's kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing in particular. Ethan had thought of this, had somehow, even years in advance, built a legal structure that anticipated exactly this kind of moment, a man trying to claim something that was never his, and a woman who might need protecting from him. With one locked deadbolt and a handful of cruel words, Marcus had just handed me everything, without any idea what he'd done. "Mr. Finch," I said, "I'd like to come in and talk this through." "Of course. Would Tuesday morning work?" I looked over at Dana, who still had no idea what had just happened but was watching me with wide, alert eyes, sensing something in my face had changed completely. Tuesday works, I said. When I hung up, Dana leaned across the table. Olivia, what in the world was that? I set the phone down slowly, my hands not quite steady. I think, I said, I'm going to need a very good lawyer. Possibly two. Harold Finch's office sat on the 14th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Cumberland River, with windows that turned the whole skyline gold in the late afternoon. I rode the elevator up alone that Tuesday in a charcoal blazer I usually reserve for school board meetings, reminding myself to breathe slowly. Finch was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of attorney who paused before every sentence like he was double-checking it against something. A printed copy of the trust sat waiting on the conference table between us. We went through it together, page by careful page. Ethan had established the trust just 8 months before his death, a fact that told me he'd been thinking about all of this even during the strange, painful stretch when we were living apart, still married on paper but not much else. The estate, spread across a rental property portfolio, an investment account, and a stake in a medical technology startup he'd quietly backed years earlier, would fully transfer to me on the 6th anniversary of the trust's founding. The language was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. Distribution would proceed only if I remained the sole legal custodian of any dependent child, free of any competing parental claim. A separate clause, the one that made my stomach drop the moment I understood it, specifically excluded any partner who had, on the record, denied paternity of that child. He thought this through carefully, I said once Finch finished. He was extremely deliberate, Finch agreed. He spoke with us at length when we drafted it. He wanted to be certain the estate reached you, and only you, without interference from anyone. I thought about Ethan, about the two of us young and imperfect, slowly drifting apart under the weight of exhaustion and unfinished conversations neither of us knew how to start. But underneath all of that, he had been, at his core, a good man. He had thought of me, even during a period when I assumed he'd stopped thinking of me at all. I thanked Finch, asked him to send the full paperwork, and left. That same afternoon, I called Renata Cole. Renata was a family law attorney a coworker had once described as terrifyingly effective, known for winning cases quietly and thoroughly rather than loudly. When I explained my situation in broad strokes, she didn't so much as pause. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "Bring anything and everything you have." I brought everything: the photographed parking citation, 3 weeks of notes I'd started keeping on Marcus's late evening walk throughs and vague explanations, and a page I'd scribbled on Dana's couch my first night there, times and phrases and dates, a record built entirely from memory. Renata reviewed it in silence, then finally looked up. "You understand that in Tennessee, a husband's denial of paternity doesn't automatically end his legal obligations unless we finalize the divorce and the paternity issue is formally resolved through the court." "I understand that." "Good. We'll file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences to start. But if we can establish infidelity for the record, the settlement terms shift considerably in your favor." She tapped the citation. "This is useful. I want something more solid." Something more solid arrived less than a week later, from a source I hadn't expected. I had a former college roommate, Tyler, who'd left teaching years ago to work in fraud investigation for an insurance company. Not exactly a private investigator, but someone who understood how to trace an ownership trail. I called and asked him to look into Coastline Rentals, LLC, the name on that parking citation. Tyler came back to me in 6 days with more than I expected. The LLC had been registered 14 months earlier, listing a second managing member, a woman named Brianna Voss, 26, an office manager for one of the subcontractors Marcus regularly worked with. The entity had signed a 12-month apartment lease at the same complex where the citation originated, an apartment listed under both their names, paid for through an account that traced back, after several redirected transfers, to a portion of our joint savings. I sat at Dana's kitchen table staring at the documents for a long time. There was no triumph in finally having proof. What I felt instead was a strange, settling clarity, the kind that comes when fog finally clears and you can see the actual ground you're standing on. I forwarded everything to Renata that same evening. Around that time, Marcus's behavior started to shift in ways that unsettled me. He hadn't reached out directly in the 2 weeks since he'd sent me out the door. No calls, no texts. But Dana mentioned a car she didn't recognize parked near her building twice in 1 week. And when I checked my mailbox at the small extended stay hotel I was living in temporarily, I found a folded note wedged into the slot. It read only, "You're making a mistake you can't take back." No signature, no explanation. I photographed it and sent it straight to Renata. She called within the hour. "Someone's rattled," she said, "which tells me they know you're actually moving forward." I hadn't said a word to Marcus. Carol, I later learned through a mutual acquaintance, had begun quietly asking around about me, where I was staying, whether I seemed stable. They were watching, and slowly they were beginning to understand that I had no intention of disappearing quietly into whatever version of the story they wanted told. Good, I remember thinking. Let them watch closely. Renata filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday morning. Marcus was served by early afternoon. I know the exact hour because Dana, working from a coffee shop near his office, texted me a single word, "Done." I was sitting in my new place when it came through. A compact 1-bedroom above a bakery that I'd signed a 6-month lease on days earlier, paying the deposit in cash from savings I'd been quietly protecting. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon every morning from the ovens below, and I chose, deliberately, to take that as a small kindness from the universe. For nearly 2 full days after the filing, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. Marcus called on a Thursday evening. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called again, voicemail again. On the 3rd attempt, I picked up, exactly the way Renata and I had rehearsed. Stay level, say little, remember everything. "Olivia." His voice sounded different than it had in months. Less certain, tighter, like a man watching a situation slip somewhere he hadn't planned for. "What do you want, Marcus? You're really doing this? Over one bad morning?" "You told me the baby I'm carrying isn't yours," I said. "And then you had the locks changed before I even left the driveway." A pause. I panicked. I said something stupid. "Were you panicking when you signed a lease with Brianna Voss?" Dead silence on the line. "Marcus, tell your attorney to reach out to Renata Cole. Good night." I hung up, set the phone face down on the counter, and stood there for a long moment. My pulse was racing, but my voice had stayed level the entire call, and somehow that mattered more to me than almost anything else that week. The following morning, Carol called from her landline. I didn't answer. She tried twice more, then left a voicemail, which I played on speaker and recorded on a second device exactly the way Renata had told me to. Her tone was measured, but only barely holding. "Olivia, I think this has all gotten out of hand, and I'd like the chance to sit down with you, just the 2 of us. I'll be in the city Friday afternoon. Somewhere neutral would be best." A pause where I could hear her breath catch and steady. "I don't think you fully grasp what you're setting in motion. There are things about your living situation, your finances, that could look very bad in front of a family court judge, especially with an infant involved." Another pause. "Just think it over." I forwarded the recording to Renata within minutes. Her reply came back dry as ever. She just built our case for us. "That's a thinly disguised custody threat. It's going straight into the file." Friday arrived. I never went to meet Carol. She came to my school instead, appearing at the front office around 1 in the afternoon, dressed like she was heading to church. The front desk called back to notify me. I asked them to say I was in a parent conference. 15 minutes later, they called again. She was still there. I asked our resource officer to walk her out. I'm told she left without incident, though the front office staff described her expression as not exactly pleasant. That same evening, Marcus emailed my work address, precisely the kind of contact workaround Renata had warned me to expect. For paragraphs, opening with how this had all spiraled out of proportion, closing with something considerably less polished. If you keep pushing this, Olivia, I will fight you on every single point for years. I know people in this town. Don't test me. I printed it and handed it straight to Renata. Perfect, she said. Keep every single one of these coming. Over the following weeks, the legal process picked up real momentum. Renata submitted the initial financial disclosures, including Tyler's documentation of the LLC and the apartment lease. Marcus's attorney, a combative litigator named Victor Lang, filed a counterpetition claiming, almost unbelievably, that our marital breakdown stemmed from my erratic emotional state during early pregnancy, meaning he intended to weaponize the very pregnancy Marcus had denied only weeks earlier. I read that filing on a Saturday morning and had to set it down and walk around the block twice before I could look at it again. Then I did something entirely out of character. I bought myself a small carton of good strawberries and a candle from the corner store, went home, and gave myself the rest of the weekend off. Not to wallow, but because I understood, from years of watching other people push through exhaustion until they broke, that you cannot keep pouring from a well nobody's refilling. I let myself rest on Saturday. I called my father in Memphis on Sunday, and his voice on the phone was steady and reassuring in the particular way a father's voice can be. Keep your head up, he said. Don't let them exhaust you into giving up. I didn't plan to. 3 days later, Marcus made his boldest move yet. He didn't call ahead. He showed up outside my apartment building one Wednesday morning as I was leaving for a prenatal appointment, standing on the sidewalk with his hands jammed in his coat pockets, wearing the practiced, humble expression of a man who had rehearsed the scene more than once. Olivia, he said quietly, please, just give me a few minutes. I have somewhere to be. I know. This won't take long. A pause. I made a mistake. A bad one. I'm telling you right now, with no lawyers around, that I'm sorry. I studied his face carefully. He had a particular expression he used to wear when he wanted something badly, an openness so practiced it almost looked genuine. I used to find it disarming. What are you actually asking me for? To drop everything. To move back in. Another pause, timed almost perfectly. I want to be part of this baby's life. This baby, I repeated. 3 weeks ago, it wasn't even yours. I watched him recalibrate right in front of me. Did you sign a lease with Brianna Voss? The practiced softness in his face flickered but didn't fully break. That's not what it looks like. It's been badly misrepresented to you. By who exactly? Whoever you assume dug through your finances. Something cold and quick moved behind his eyes before he smoothed it back over. Olivia, we don't need any of this. No courts, no lawyers standing between us. Just sit down with me and figure out what's actually fair. There it was, fair, meaning outside the process, outside the record, in some private room where fairness would end up being whatever he could talk me into. I appreciate you coming by, I said, my voice level despite the tremor in my hands hidden inside my coat pockets. My attorney is Renata Cole. The numbers on the paperwork your lawyer already has. Have Victor reach out to her. I stepped past him and headed for my car. He called out once behind me. I didn't turn around. At the appointment, the doctor pressed the Doppler against my belly, and the room filled with that fast, insistent rhythm. My baby's heartbeat, steady and sure of itself. I lay there on the exam table and felt something in my chest finally settle, something that had been shaking loose for weeks. This was the thing I was actually protecting. Everything else was just logistics I had to manage on the way there. That afternoon I met Dana and 2 other friends for lunch, Marisol, a school counselor who had sat with more heartbreak than most people could imagine, and Priya, a paralegal who understood exactly the machinery I was up against. We spent 2 hours at a small cafe, and not once did anyone suggest I slow down, or lower my expectations, or think twice about what Marcus might have meant by this baby. Marisol told me, You're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Priya said that LLC and lease are going to be a serious problem for him. Tennessee courts don't love hidden assets. Dana didn't say much of substance, but she kept refilling my water glass and, right before we left, told me simply, "I'm proud of you," in a way that landed somewhere deep and quiet inside me. I drove home that evening through streets just beginning to turn toward autumn color, the sky a clean, deepening blue. I was 19 weeks along. My little apartment smelled like cinnamon from the bakery downstairs, layered now with the vanilla candle I'd lit that morning. I sat at my small table, opened my laptop, and wrote out everything from that morning's encounter with careful precision. The exact time, the phrase, "this baby," his request to settle things quietly outside the legal process, his half-admission that he knew I'd looked into his finances. I sent it all to Renata. Then I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the street below shift from gold light to street lamp glow. I wasn't at peace exactly. There was still real fear underneath everything, fear of a drawn-out fight, of what Victor Lang might try next, of the ways a man with money and connections could stretch a process out until it broke you financially and emotionally both. But I had learned, somewhere in those weeks, that fear and determination can occupy the exact same body at the exact same time. What mattered was which one you let drive. They arrived together on a Saturday. I should have anticipated it. Honestly, the pattern had been building exactly the way Renata and I had sketched out on a legal pad the week before. First the calls, then the written threats, then the personal appeal, and finally, when every softer option ran out, the coordinated approach. When you close doors one at a time, eventually people come at you through whichever one's left. My buzzer rang at 10:30 that morning. I checked the little camera screen and saw two figures waiting downstairs, Marcus and Carol. I thought about ignoring it entirely. Then I remembered what Renata had told me more than once. If they come to you, let them talk, because the more they say, the more ammunition I have. I pressed the buzzer. They came up together, which was its own kind of statement. Carol as backup, as witness, as moral authority. She was dressed like she was attending a formal luncheon, pearl earrings, a sharply tailored coat, wearing an expression of careful pleasantness that never once reached her eyes. "Olivia," she said, stepping past my threshold, "thank you for letting us in. I know this whole thing has been a lot. I didn't offer either of them a seat. I stood in the center of my small living room, arms loosely folded, and waited. Marcus lowered himself onto the edge of my couch anyway, elbows on his knees, adopting a posture designed to look contrite. Carol remained standing, positioning herself. I noticed, close enough to the door that it felt intentional. "We want to fix this," Marcus said. "As a family." "We're not a family anymore," I said. "We're a pending divorce with a court date." Carol absorbed that without visible reaction, then produced a careful, practiced smile. "Olivia, I think whoever's advising you isn't entirely on your side here. You have an attorney. That's certainly your right. But attorneys thrive on conflict because conflict is what pays their bills. What Marcus and I are asking for is simply a conversation between people who share history. We have attorneys because there are legal matters that need resolving," I said. She nodded as though I'd conceded a point. "And those matters can absolutely be resolved. But how they get resolved will shape the next decade for everyone involved, including your child." A brief pause. "A drawn-out divorce affects children badly, Olivia. The research is very clear. Kids do better with two involved parents talking, not fighting through lawyers." There it was, the turn toward the baby. They'd moved from pressure to appeal to concern, all in one visit, and under other circumstances, with a different woman, it might have actually worked. "I agree completely that children need stability," I said, "which is exactly why I intend to make sure my child is born into a home with one clear, financially secure guardian, without anyone contradicting themselves about whether they even want to be part of that child's life." Something in Carol's expression thinned. That's an awfully deliberate way of phrasing things. I run a school building for a living, I said. I choose my words carefully. Marcus stood up abruptly, the contrite posture gone entirely. Olivia, listen to me. If you keep pushing this divorce the way you're pushing it, digging through my business, pushing this infidelity narrative, I will make every single part of this as difficult as legally possible. I'll contest paternity outright. I'll file for joint custody. I'll drag this through court for years, and you'll burn through every dollar you have trying to raise a newborn by yourself. Is that honestly what you want? I looked up at him, closer now than was comfortable, jaw set in the particular way of a man who'd rehearsed a speech and fully expected it to land. Marcus, I said, you told me this child wasn't yours, standing in our bathroom with no witnesses. Then you repeated it, in slightly more careful language, over email to my workplace. I paused. You can't deny paternity, and then turn around and petition for custody in the same breath. Family courts tend to notice that particular contradiction. Carol made a sharp, involuntary sound, somewhere between a gasp and a word. And beyond that, I continued, any petition claiming infidelity on my part, which is clearly what your counterfiling is implying, is going to trigger full discovery. Discovery means complete financial disclosure from both of us. I'm genuinely looking forward to it. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Then Marcus said, low and hard, You think this makes you clever? I think I have excellent legal representation, I said. And I think we're finished here. Anything further can go through Victor to Renata. I walked to the door and opened it. Carol went first, brushing past me without a glance, which told me more about her composure than any parting words could have. Marcus paused in the doorway, and for just a second I saw something cross his face that I hadn't seen there before. Not quite anger, something more fragile than that. The look of a man who had been certain how this would go and was watching that certainty come apart in real time. This isn't finished, he said. No, I agreed. It'll finish in family court. I shut the door and stood in my entryway for close to a minute. Then I walked to the kitchen, drank a full glass of water standing at the sink, and noticed my hands trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, more from the sheer physical cost of staying composed when every nerve wants to unravel. Underneath the trembling, though, was something else entirely, a kind of settled resolve, more solid, somehow, than it had been before they ever knocked. The first hearing landed on a Thursday in early February. Renata and I spent nearly 2 months preparing, with the kind of exacting attention I had come to expect from her. Every document indexed, every claim cross-referenced against evidence. The LLC filing, the apartment lease with both signatures, the citation, the email to my workplace, Carol's recorded voicemail. I was 26 weeks along when I walked into the Davison County family courtroom that morning. My principal had given me the day off without a single question, and Dana had offered to come along. I told her to stay close by phone instead. This part, I needed to carry myself. The courtroom was smaller and plainer than I expected, nothing like the dramatic sets on television. Victor Lang was already seated with an associate, papers spread across the table. Marcus sat beside him in a navy suit I recognized from our wedding. He didn't look my way once. Carol sat in the gallery, not a party to the case, but her presence clearly meant to communicate something. I noticed it and let it go. Renata and I took our seats. As always, she was the steadiest person in the room. The first hour unfolded exactly as expected. Procedural matters, a few clarifying questions from the bench, documents entered into the record. Then Renata requested the court review the financial disclosures, and the entire mood in the room shifted. Victor objected to the scope, arguing Coastline Rentals was an independent business entity unrelated to the marital estate. Renata answered with case law establishing that a jointly held LLC formed during the marriage, funded through shared assets, counts as marital property regardless of how it's structured on paper. She entered the withdrawal history, The apartment lease co-signed by Marcus and Brianna Voss, and documentation showing Brianna as a co-managing member of the same entity. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Okafor, a woman who carried herself like someone who had heard every version of every story at least twice, reviewed everything in silence before turning to Victor. "Counselor, does your client dispute that these funds came from the marital account?" Victor conferred with Marcus in a low voice. "Your Honor, Mr. Doyle maintains these were legitimate business expenses." Business expenses toward an apartment lease co-signed with a woman who appears on no other filing connected to your client's company, Judge Okafor said, her tone perfectly even, the evenness of someone who has already reached a private conclusion. Next came Marcus's counterpetition, the claim of emotional instability. Victor presented it with as much confidence as the material allowed, which wasn't much. A letter from a coworker describing me as unusually tense lately, and one screenshot of a frustrated text I'd sent Marcus back in July. He read part of it into the record. Renata let him finish, then stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to respond with additional context." She entered the full exchange, not just my message, but Marcus's replies, in which he dismissed my concerns and, at one point, suggested I was overreacting. Then she read Marcus's email into the record, the one containing the line, "I know people," and played Carol's voicemail aloud for the courtroom. The recording filled the small space. Carol's careful voice, "There are things about your situation that could look very bad. Just think it over." I watched Carol in the gallery. Her expression barely shifted, but something in her posture tightened almost imperceptibly, the particular stillness of composure that is starting to cost something. Judge Okafor listened to the entire recording without interruption, then set her pen down. "Mr. Lang, your client's counterpetition alleges emotional instability. During that same period, your client emailed the petitioner at her workplace implying professional consequences if she continued this filing, and his mother placed a call carrying a similar implication. This court takes a firm view of intimidation tactics used against a represented party during active litigation." Victor began to respond. Judge Okafor lifted a hand, and he stopped mid-sentence. That's when I saw Marcus's composure crack open. He leaned toward Victor and murmured something urgent. Victor answered low and clipped. Marcus's jaw tightened, and his eyes cut once toward the gallery, toward his mother, and something passed between them that looked, from where I sat, exactly like two people realizing, together, that they had badly misjudged this. Then Victor, in a move I hadn't anticipated, stood and said, "Your Honor, my client wishes to formally withdraw the counterpetition. You don't get to withdraw mid-hearing because the opposing evidence turned out to be strong," Judge Okafor said crisply. "That assessment should have happened before filing. We'll continue." The final matter of the morning was paternity. Renata laid the facts out plainly. Marcus Doyle had, on the morning I was told to leave, verbally denied paternity and had later repeated the same claim in writing. She entered the email as evidence. There was no meaningful objection available. Judge Okafor turned to look directly at Marcus, unusual from what I'd seen of her otherwise measured demeanor that morning. "Mr. Doyle, is it your position today that this child is yours?" The pause stretched long enough that I could hear the air system cycling, someone shifting in the gallery behind me, the quiet drum of my own pulse. "Yes," Marcus said. "Then your earlier written denial," Judge Okafor said, "creates a legal contradiction this court intends to resolve carefully. I'll expect supplemental briefs on the paternity question within 10 days. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks for closing arguments." She adjourned the session there. Renata and I walked out into the hallway together. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "He just contradicted his own written record, under oath in front of a judge." A small, contained smile. That is the best possible thing that could have happened today. I stood in that courthouse hallway, 26 weeks pregnant, steady on my feet, and let myself feel, just briefly, the particular satisfaction of standing at the center of a storm without being knocked off balance. Outside, the February air was sharp and clean, and the light over the river looked almost hopeful. 3 weeks later, we returned to Judge Okafor's courtroom. In the interim, Renata had filed her brief arguing that Marcus's written denial of paternity constituted a formal relinquishment of parental claim under Tennessee family law, and that his later reversal was strategically motivated rather than sincere. Discovery had also turned up a second problem for Marcus: a personal loan drawn against our shared home equity, with the proceeds routed directly into coastline rentals. It was now sitting in the court record for everyone to see. On the morning of the final hearing, I wore the same charcoal blazer. It no longer buttoned in front. I wore it open anyway and thought, quietly, good, let the whole room see exactly what's actually at stake here. Renata presented the financial evidence with her usual precision: the hidden LLC, the co-signed lease, the misappropriated loan, and closed with language we'd worked out together over several late nights. Ms. Hayes asks only that the record reflect the truth of what happened here: a marriage in which one party concealed assets, denied paternity, and attempted to use the legal system itself as leverage against her. She asks that this court recognize her child's right to a stable, undisputed home and award the relief this evidence clearly supports. Victor argued with a confidence he could no longer fully back up. Judge Okafor listened without expression, asked 2 sharp questions about the financial timeline, and adjourned to deliberate. We waited close to an hour. When she returned, she didn't waste any time. The evidence of financial concealment is substantial and effectively unchallenged. The petitioner is awarded her full financial settlement, 50% of the appraised value of the marital home, full recovery of the misappropriated loan proceeds, and all associated legal costs. A pause. Mr. Doyle's written denial of paternity constitutes a voluntary relinquishment of parental claim under Tennessee statute. His later, mid-proceeding reversal is found to be strategically motivated rather than genuine. Sole legal guardianship of the minor child is awarded to the petitioner. Behind me, I heard Carol make a small, sharp sound in the gallery. The intimidation communications directed at the petitioner throughout these proceedings will be referred to the State Bar for review. The divorce is granted. This matter is closed. Outside on the courthouse steps, I called Harold Finch immediately. Sole guardianship, I said, effective as of today. The trust transfer should still be on track for spring. A locked deadbolt that had turned, without Marcus ever grasping what he'd actually done, into the exact key I needed. I stood there in the cold, clear February sun, one hand resting against my belly, and let myself smile fully for what felt like the first time in months. Before I tell you about the day my son was born, I want to tell you about the weeks leading up to it, because they turned out to be some of the calmest, most ordinary weeks I'd had in over a year. The case was resolved. The apartment complex, the LLC, none of it was my problem to untangle anymore. I spent my evenings assembling a crib with instructions that made no sense, painting one wall of the nursery a soft, dusty blue, reading through the same handful of parenting books everyone reads, underlining the sentences that felt true and skimming past the ones that didn't. Dana came by most Sundays with takeout, and we'd sit cross-legged on the nursery floor talking about absolutely nothing important, which, after everything, felt like its own quiet form of luxury. My son was born in early May, 7 pounds 2 ounces, a startling amount of dark hair, and a solemn little frown the nurses joked he must have inherited from a very serious ancestor. Dana was in the delivery room and cried far more than I did. My father flew in from Memphis and held him for a long, wordless stretch before finally saying quietly, "Well, hello there. We've been waiting for you." I named him Ethan, after the man whose foresight, years earlier, had quietly protected a future he never got to witness firsthand. The trust transfer that spring, right on schedule. I signed the final paperwork in Finch's office on an unremarkable gray morning, and when it was finished, He shook my hand and said simply, "Ethan would be proud of you." I believed him completely. I kept my job, negotiated a slightly reduced schedule, hired a nanny I trust completely, and eventually bought a small house of my own with a modest backyard where I planted tomatoes, and once spring rolled around, a row of daffodils along the fence line. Ordinary things. Deliberately, stubbornly ordinary. Marcus lost 2 major client relationships within months of the ruling, once the discovery records became part of the public file. Victor Lang received a formal reprimand from the State Bar Association. Brianna Voss, who it turned out had genuinely not known the full extent of what she'd been pulled into, filed her own civil complaint against Marcus for misrepresentation. The apartment complex ended up terminating the LLC's lease entirely once the legal filings became public. I stopped tracking any of it after a while. Carol's opinion of me traveled through the usual chain of mutual acquaintances, the way these things always do. I simply stopped making space for it in my head. Marcus wrote to me once, months later, no threats this time, just a handful of short, quiet sentences that read like something written at 2 a.m. He hoped I was doing well. He hoped our son was healthy. I read it once, saved it in a folder I never opened again, and didn't respond. What I gave my time to instead, my son and his little bouncer on the kitchen floor while I made dinner most evenings. Early morning walks through my neighborhood, watching the seasons quietly turn over. Long, unhurried Sunday calls with my father. The particular, unhurried weight of a sleeping baby against my chest at 2 a.m, which no one properly warns you about, and which I wouldn't trade for anything now. People sometimes ask me, when they hear a version of this story secondhand, whether I feel strange about the money, whether it's odd to have rebuilt an entire life on an inheritance that only existed because of a tragedy I never fully recovered from. I understand the question because I've asked it of myself more than once, usually late at night with the baby monitor humming on the nightstand. But I've come to believe Ethan didn't leave me $120 million to make me feel complicated about it. He left it because, even from a distance, even years after everything between us had gone quiet, he understood that I might one day need solid ground beneath me if the world ever tried to knock me off it. I don't think of it as a windfall. I think of it as a door someone quietly left unlocked for me, long before either of us knew how badly I'd eventually need somewhere safe to run. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from being doubted by the one person who is supposed to know you better than anyone. It settles quietly into your shoulders and the back of your jaw, and you carry it into ordinary rooms without anyone noticing it's there at all. If you're carrying something similar right now, know that it's entirely possible to keep showing up for your life while still fighting a private battle underneath it. You don't have to fall apart to prove you're hurting. I also think, more often than I probably should, about the version of that September morning where I made a different choice, where I stayed quiet, where I let Marcus's certainty go unchallenged, where I tried to smooth everything over for the sake of a baby who wasn't even born yet. I know exactly how easy that smaller, softer path would have been to choose, and I don't judge any woman who chooses it, because I understand precisely how it happens. But I'm endlessly grateful, every single day, that I didn't take it. My son is a little over a year old now. He has his father's stubborn eyebrows and, according to everyone who meets him, my exact laugh, which I honestly never noticed until strangers kept pointing it out. He has no idea, of course, about lawyers or trusts or courtrooms, or the man whose last name he doesn't carry. Someday, when he's old enough for real questions, I'll tell him the truth in language he can actually hold on to. I'll tell him his mother was frightened once, and without a home for exactly one night, and that she stood in a cold driveway and heard some very cruel words and did not fall apart. I'll tell him that sometimes the very worst night of your life quietly becomes, months later, the start of the best one, even though there's no way to know that while you're actually living through it. Here's what I've come to understand, and what I hope stays with you if nothing else from this story does. The people who try to shrink you are almost always counting on your silence. They're betting that you'll simply absorb the fallout of their choices and ask for nothing back in return. The moment you stop absorbing, the moment you pick up the phone, hire the attorney, keep the documentation, and refuse to be moved, everything starts to change. So I'll leave you with the same question I asked myself in that dark driveway, porch light clicking off behind me. If someone locked you out of your own life without warning, what would you actually do about it? And how long would you wait before you started? If Olivia's story stayed with you tonight, make sure you're subscribed to Kate's Fortune Stories, because there are so many more journeys just like hers still waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from, and I'll see you next time.